Hi, everybody. So, this is the fourth and final installment of reviewing for the final exam, and we're going to talk about the multiple choice portion of the final exam. I'm going to talk to you about basically the multiple choice portion of the whole exam, the AP exam that you'll take in May 1st, and then we'll kind of come back and talk a little bit about how this will look on the final. So, the first thing is the structure of the test. For the whole AP exam, the structure of the test is a little bit different. First of all, keep in mind that the multiple choice questions are there because they want to see what kind of readers you are. And they're looking to try to find the best possible readers for the AP exam. So they're looking for ones who are thoughtful and not superficial and impulsive, where you think, oh, I'm just going to choose this answer because it seems right. They want to be able to separate the people who know the correct answer. So on the AP exam, the multiple choice portion will be the first thing that you take, and it's the first hour of testing. It's 1 hour, and you have between 45 and 60 questions on it, and there's 4 or 5 passages. Now, the last few years, it's been 55 questions almost every year. So you're looking at about 1 question a minute that you're going to be answering. Scoring, as far as the AP exam is concerned, this is 45% of your score on the AP Lang test. The other 55% is made up of the 3 timed writes that you're going to be doing. So they give you a little bit better percentage on how well you write with the 3 essays. But this one is a big chunk, too, of what you have on the final exam or on the AP exam. So if you think about scoring for the AP exam, to earn a 5, you've got to get a score on the multiple choice of 80% or better. Most of the questions answered correctly. To get a 3, you have to get at the very least 50% of the questions correct, 50 to 60% of the questions correct. So that brings me to the multiple choice exam on this final exam. So you will be asked, you're going to be given half of an AP exam, 2 passages, 25 questions, and you'll have about 35 minutes to answer those questions. So in order to do that, that means about 1 question a minute with a little bit of extra time to think. We're going to be curving this an AP style curve. So what that means, at this point of the year, to get an A on the multiple choice section, you have to earn 70% or better on those 25 questions. To get a B, 60% or better, 60% to 69%. To get a C, 50% to 59%. D, 40% to 49%. And to fail, it's less than 40%. So 39% and below would be an F on the multiple choice portion of the exam. All right, so while you take the AP exam and the final exam for that matter, there are some things that you're going to be expected to know and questions that they're going to ask you. There are some questions about grammar and sentence structure and your ability to follow the complicated syntax of some of the readings. There's some questions about diction, like specific word choice and things like that. There is a lot of upper level vocabulary. Remember when we took that kind of mock AP exam questions for the reading that we did, A Modest Proposal? As you knew, there were some vocabulary issues with that one, so you got to be ready for that. You have to be familiar with some of the rhetorical strategies and the terminology that's used for those rhetorical strategies and substitutes. Remember how we looked at the substitutes for ethos, pathos, and logos? So there are substitutes like an appeal to ethos can be considered an authoritative appeal. Then there's the ability to make inferences, draw conclusions about the text. There's always questions about tone and what the author intended. And then there's questions about organization, how things are organized within the text and the author's style. And then modes of discourse. We talked about modes, remember, persuasive, argumentative, narrative, descriptive, and then rhetorical strategies that we've been talking about this whole year so far. And then there's one other type of question, understanding citations and how citations work and how using those contribute to what the author is doing. So here's some advice that I have for you. When you're working on multiple choice questions for the AP exam, you should think about 1 question per minute. Annotate the text. Circle things that you see that you think are important, underline them, read them closely, and then pay attention to things like punctuation and diction and pacing and organization. If you see an author using a rhetorical strategy as you're reading through the passage, make a note of that. Like if you recognize what that strategy is, because there probably will be a question about that. Read the passage as if you were reading it aloud to an audience. You can read it aloud in your head, thinking about meaning and intent. And hear the words in your head as you are reading it. It helps if you think about the words instead of just looking at the page. It helps you hear what the author intended in the first place. So for people who have difficulty like staying focused on a passage, some advice that I give them is to use your finger as a pointer and read it as you're reading it in your head so that you don't skip ahead or miss things. Also, please pay attention to everything listed at the beginning of the passage, everything in italics. So it gives you everything, a lot of things about the passage that you should know. Sometimes the occasion, date of publication, information about the title and the author that's included in there. Once again, be aware of anything that you think is a rhetorical device or organizational techniques, and then think about the lines and details that you're seeing as you go through it. Finally, skim the questions and ignore the choices once you start. Like read the passage first and really focus on reading the passage. Then skim through the question stems. Don't look at the choices right away, but look at the question stems. Some people say jump to the passage first and skim the question stems. If you feel like you're a fast reader, that's the technique that I use. I jump to the questions before I read the passage, and then I kind of know what's required of me when the passage comes around. But if you're not a fast reader, skim through the questions like after you're done reading the passage before you start answering the questions. All right. So there are some basic patterns that the AP test makers use, and here's the first one. A very straightforward question, which is it gives you the stem, the passage is an example of, and then your choices are A, B, C, D, and E. So it basically finishes the sentence, or the pronoun it refers to, and then it gives you the option choices that basically finish the question stem. That's a very straightforward question and pretty easy to understand what you're looking for. The next type of question is where it asks you to look at specific lines. So, for example, lines 52 and 57 serve to A, reinforce the author's thesis. So you have to go back and look at those specific lines. Sometimes, again, if you are a very fast reader and you can do some pre-annotation, if you look at the question stems and you see that one of the questions says something like this, lines 52 to 57 serve to, what I've always done in the past is I've jumped ahead to the passage, or I've read the stem, I go back to the passage and I mark in the passage where those lines are, and I put like a question mark or a little bracket by it so I know to pay special attention to those lines. All right, the all except, these are tough ones, and it requires a little bit more time because all of the answers are correct except one of them. So here's an example. The AP English Language and Composition exam is all of the following except given in May of each year, open to high school juniors, published in the New York Times, used as a qualifier for college credit, is a 3-hour test. Obviously, those are all correct except for it is published in the New York Times. So you have to kind of make sure that you know that all those other choices are incorrect before you choose it. Watch out for except, because if you skip over reading that, you will answer A every time, because A will probably not be the correct answer for the test, but it'll seem correct because you've skipped over except. All right, example number 4 is making an inference. These are tough for people because it's asking you to understand tone and maybe interpreting the passage a little bit more, and some people have more difficult time doing that. So in Letter from Birmingham Jail, the reader can infer the speaker is E, religious. All right. Then, like the one we looked at in the example from A Modest Proposal, there were a lot of these Roman numeral questions. Remember, you have to go through these choices first and answer true or false for each of these, and then decide which one most closely matches the option of which ones are right and which ones are wrong. It will appear on the tests this year and on future tests, but not in the same degree that it appeared on the sample one that we gave you with a modest proposal. All right, and then question number 6, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in class on Tuesday, is the footnote question. So there are passages that have footnotes attached to them, and you have to understand what the footnote is and what its purpose is. So the purpose of a footnote is to cite a primary source, verify the writer's assertions, direct the reader to other sources, cite a secondary source, or provide the writer's additional commentary. This is all of the above. So footnotes can do all of those things, and we're going to take a look at some today so you can kind of see what questions you might be asked about footnotes on the exam. All right, in general, don't jump around in the exam. Like some people will give you advice to work on what you think is an easy passage if you think the first passage is hard and go back to it, but it might be difficult for you to get back to it. Do write on the exam booklet. Write on it, mark it up, cross things off. Don't be afraid of doing that. But don't spend too much time on one question. Remember, the clock is ticking. If you're not sure about it, move on to the next question. You can go back to it at the end if you have time left at the end. Otherwise, you can just fill in like what you think is the closest option. Don't be misled by the length or appearance of selection. Between this and the difficulty of the question, there's no correlation. So the questions might be easier for a more complex passage, like easier choice questions, because remember how we talked about how the exam used to be set up with easy questions and more difficult questions. All right. Some other little advice, general guidelines: consider all the answer choices. Keep an open mind as you answer questions that kind of go in a series. All parts of the answer have to be correct, and then always go back to the test or the reading to kind of help you make a choice. So I like process of elimination as a tool that I use, where I knock out the ones that I'm pretty sure aren't correct, and then I can choose between the ones that are left over. It helps me get a little bit closer to the correct answer. And I also like substitution or fill in the blank. So I think about the question in terms of a fill in the blank question instead of a multiple choice, or I think about what the answer of the question is going to be before I even look at the choices, and that kind of helps me narrow down quickly. I'm using context, so when it asks you to look at a specific line or a word or a phrase, make sure you go back into the passage and look at that. And as you're reading the passage, think about what you might be asked a question about if you run across rhetorical strategy or something really interesting. Finally, go with your gut when you're not 100% sure. Make an educated guess the best way that you can and trust what you've learned. All right, some survival plans. So if you are running out of time and you haven't finished the last selection, look for the easy questions. So questions that are the shortest, questions that point you to a specific line that you can run and just like look at and maybe read one paragraph of the passage instead of the whole thing. There could be definition questions, like the vocabulary questions that you might be able to answer, or those self-contained questions like the straightforward question we talked about at the beginning that you might be able to answer without having to look too much at the passage. And then, if you are running out of time, answer every question. Fill in a dot for every question. The chances of you getting one of those right is about 20%, and that's better than 0%, which is if you leave them blank. So fill them in and guess on them. You can't, however, guess on the entire exam and do well, because again, chances are you'll probably get a 20%, and remember, you need a 50% to get that 3. Okay, so we're going to work in class a little bit on some of these questions with some practice passages on Tuesday.